Today is a shorter day, so we will get you away just around about lunchtime today. But we have got some really good sessions today, and we are looking forward to our speakers. And we're going to start with prevention. I should just check, actually, can you see me in this? That'll teach me, won't it, to wear a blue suit with a blue background. But we are going to start with prevention this morning, and to tell us a lot more, would you please welcome the Chief Constable of Merseyside Police, who is Serena Kennedy, KPM, and also Dr. Rick Muir, who's the Director of Police Foundation. Let's give them both a round of applause, please. Good morning. You're on first.
I think I'm on first, yeah. We think I'm on first, yes, I am. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you today. I'm going to talk, first of all, about the role that the police play in prevention. And I think Paul mentioned yesterday in his talk some of the work that we did at the Police Foundation with the strategic review of policing in England and Wales. It was a big review of the future of policing that we did, completed about a year ago. And in that we said there needs to be a big shift in the way we think about crime and harm so that we're focused much more on preventing it from happening in the first place. Easy to say, difficult to do. I'm going to ask you a question first, which is, how many of you think that policing should focus on preventing crime and harm? You put your hands up. Okay, a lot of people. How many of you think that policing does focus on preventing crime and harm? A few, one or two, a few people do, and a few people kind of half raising their hands and so on. And therein, I think, lies the tension which I'm going to address, which is that we all think that prevention is really important, but that policing is, and has for a long time, been locked in a very reactive mode to dealing with all of the day-to-day issues that, that you guys have to deal with. And it's not just policing, it's other public services as well. Now, who can name the gentleman that I've put up on the screen here? Does anyone know who that is?
Me, because he's in my slides as well.
Go on then.
It's Robert Peel.
It's Robert Peel. It is Robert Peel. I'm sure a few of you guessed that it probably was Robert Peel, given that it's a talk about policing and it's a picture of a 19th century politician. It probably is going to be Peel. And it is Peel. And the reason I put Peel up there is because from the very beginning, he put an emphasis on prevention into the ethos of policing in this country. And indeed, if you look at the Peelian principles, now, of course, I should say Peel didn't write the Peelian principles. Sorry to say that if anyone thought that Peel did write the Peelian principles. He said lots of things about policing which are reflected in the Peelian principles. But the Peelian principles reflect instructions which were given to the first officers in the Met, probably by Rowan and Main, the first Met commissioners. And the 9 Peelian principles that everybody learns were written in 1948 by a guy called Charles Reith in a short history of British policing. But they reflect the thinking of Peel. And if you look at those principles, the first one is that the role of the police is to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. And the 9th principle is to recognise always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder and not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. So there it is, right at the heart of, if you like, the foundational principles underpinning British policing. But what I'm going to do now is talk you through a sort of short history of the relationship between prevention and policing in this country, and in doing so, look at how this relationship has sort of waxed and waned over time. Now, who knows who this is? Anyone guess? Or anyone remember which film this character appears in? Mary Poppins, that's right. It's Constable Jones from Mary Poppins. I'm going to say something very uncool, which is this is one of my favourite films. And one of the reasons I have watched it a lot with my two very small children. And one of the reasons I like Mary Poppins is that it's a very, very interesting portrait and examination of Edwardian England, and it has in it, class commentary on class and sort of the whole upstairs downstairs thing. It has the whole birth and rise of the suffragette movement. The campaign for women's votes is a big part of that film. But also, there's a really interesting vignette about the role of policing, which is through the character of Constable Jones. There's a brilliant bit where the chimney sweeps come down the chimney after having done that dance up on the roofs, and then they come down and they start dancing with Constable Jones in the street, and he sort of said, get on with you, and gives him a clip round the ear. And there, in that one scene, is basically the myth of the British Bobby, which is, friendly, approachable, doesn't use force, gives people maybe a clip round the ear, but it's that notion of the approachable constable as a sort of person of the people, and it's captured in that film. But in terms of prevention, the relationship to what I'm saying is that, what does Constable Jones do in Mary Poppins? Well, he pretty much just sort of plods about, he just walks around. And I think that's what Peel meant by prevention. It's not a particularly sophisticated view of prevention, but that was the original idea. It was that by having police officers on the street, a professional cadre of police officers on the street, that would deter people from committing crimes. And in fact, we do have good evidence that from the research that in high crime areas, police visibility does deter crime. So there is some evidence for Peel's intuition there. But I think that's what the Victorians meant by prevention, by the preventative role of the police. But of course, all of that changed as society became more complex. And towards the end of the 19th century, originally they hadn't wanted to get into crime investigation. So crime investigation came very late. The first CID was opened in the Met towards the latter stages of the 19th century. And the British were very suspicious about this idea of detectives, because it sounded a bit French, It sounded a bit like people were going to be spying on you. And that was something that Peel had been keen to avoid. But crime rises throughout the 19th century, and eventually the police take on this crime investigation role. And then, of course, we get the invention of the motor car. This is Z cars a bit later on, and the birth of kind of emergency response policing. And these two things, investigation and response, then take on, they are the things that are really how local policing manifests itself and the fundamental basis of local policing, which remains true throughout the 20th century. And prevention kind of falls away, and the Bobby on the beat is kind of marginalised. And we do then see, towards the latter part of the 20th century, a real sense that the distance between the police and the public has been growing. They have this idea that the police have retreated to their cars and their vans, they're not out on the streets, and partly as a consequence of that, they're not in this kind of preventative mode. Then I think we do see a preventative turn at the start of the 21st century under the previous Labour government, where you have two really important things that I think happened. One is the 1998 Crime and Disorder Act, which I still think is a very good piece of legislation. It's still on the statute book, but with much of the impetus behind it lost, I think. And that placed this duty on local authorities to work with partners to reduce crime. And then the second thing they did was roll out neighbourhood policing in a much more ambitious way to every council ward in England and Wales. And that wasn't just Constable Jones plodding about, because there was visibility was a big part of it, but there was also this emphasis on problem solving, based on all of the evidence, particularly from the United States, that problem-oriented policing, in other words, focusing not just on incidents but on the problems that sit behind those incidents, that is a very effective way of reducing crime. And so we saw this push for prevention, I think, during the 2000s. And then what we have is austerity, and I think that's the thing that means that all of that has gone into retreat since then, and that neighbourhood policing, as we know, was cut back very significantly. Community safety partnerships have lost a lot of the impetus that I think they previously had, partly due to less resources, but also partly because you had Police and Crime Commissioners brought in, which meant the local authority relationship was less significant, I think, for policing. And so all of that, I think, has led us to where we are now, which is lots of interest in prevention, and I think growing interest in prevention, lots of work, particularly around violence through the violence reduction units and so on, but still a system which is overwhelmingly reactive and dealing with crisis coming through the door. So, what do we need to do? What does preventative policing look like then? I think that I first need to say a few things before I get into preventative policing. The first thing is about what the role of the police is. Now, I'm not going to talk for an hour about that because I could do, but in our report on the strategic review of policing, we have a whole chapter on the role of the police, and I do recommend it because a lot of thought went into it. But in the end, to cut a very long story short, what we concluded in that piece of work was that the role of the police is really rooted in the powers and the authority that the police have. You know, the reason that I am, different to most of you is that I don't have a warrant card, and you guys, because you've got warrant cards, can do things that I and most other people can't do. And it's because of that that we then deploy police officers to threat, harm and risk where the possession of those powers may be efficacious for keeping people safe or securing justice for victims or whatever other outcomes we're talking about. That essentially is what I think the role of the police is. And that means something very important for prevention, which is that the police are inevitably going to be working downstream. You know, they're not working upstream, they're working downstream mainly. You're working where problems have manifested themselves. And that also means that most of the work in terms of prevention is going to be done by other people, by education, by health, by local authorities, by business, by local communities, and so forth. But the police play a very important role in it, I think, because the police make key decisions which can set people on one course or another course, and one of those, one of those paths may be more likely to lead to something not happening again, and one of those paths may be not likely to, may mean that things simply reoccur. So I've got 4 Ps. I think if you've got a model, you'd better have 4 Ps. So I've got 4 Ps. We'll see if you can sort of guess what they are. The first one, preventative policing needs to be person-centered. So it needs to be about people, not incidents. It needs to be about when police officers are faced with individuals thinking about and having a preventative mindset about how do we prevent this person being back here again? You know, what are we going to do now to try to help this situation, whether it's someone who's been a victim of crime or harm or someone who's been a perpetrator? What can we do, and how can we use our decision-making power and our authority to try to prevent this happening again? And that is about being person-centered, not incident-centered. And lots of the stuff that's going out there at the moment, and there's lots of different schools of thought focused on particular aspects of crime and harm. You know, people talk about being trauma-informed, taking a public health approach, focusing on adverse childhood conditions. You know, all of these things, I think, basically are about being person-centered. So I would encapsulate all of those things within that part of prevention. The second P is about being problem-oriented, and this is what I was talking about before, which is there's a huge amount of evidence that focusing on problems, not incidents, is a very effective way of reducing crime. And this, of course, is where neighbourhood policing comes in, because it is the place that has the capacity to do that more proactive problem-solving work. The third P is about place, because people and problems happen in places, and you can only really understand what's going on and what's driving them if you're really rooted in those communities and you really understand what makes them tick and what's going on. And so again, that takes us back to neighbourhood policing, I think, as a core element of any kind of prevention strategy. And the final one is about partnership, probably the most overused word in the English language, but nonetheless it's overused because it's really important. And that is that, you know, the police are going to have to work as part of a wider system in order to deliver any of this. You know, policing in a system is the only way that we can address the kind of complex, wicked issues that that kind of dominate the agenda today. So these are the 4 Ps of preventative policing that, that we think are important. And we're doing a piece of work at the moment, which is to try to think about what would a local police force look like if it was built around these 4 Ps. What is the local operating model if you base it on these 4 Ps? And how does that look different from what we have now? And that's a piece of work which we're currently developing. So, how do we get there? I think that there's a number of sort of building blocks here. The first one is we need a vision. And I think one of the challenges in this space is, as I was saying, there's lots of really good work going on, and there's lots of elements of prevention focused on specific problems. But if you're going to shift an oil tanker, if you're going to really change a system, you need a vision which really drives the thing and brings it all together in a really coherent way. And so at the moment we've got lots of talk about public health approach, be trauma informed, focus on adverse childhood experiences, understand those, try to understand the impact of things like neurodiversity on the way people behave. And there's lots of stuff going on out there which is really interesting and really important, but I think you need to draw it together into something like, might not be the best phrase, preventative policing, in the same way we have evidence-based policing or intelligence-led policing. If you're going to shift a system, you've got to put a big label on something and say, this is what we're trying to do. So I think we need a coherent vision, and the 4 Ps I talked about are an attempt on our part to try to draw that together. We also need an evidence base, and I think there is a lot of good evidence there around what works in terms of prevention, but the key thing with that is we need to get it into the hands of practitioners in a way which is accessible and they find useful. And I think we need a movement. We need a movement for change. We need a network of practitioners in policing who are committed to doing this kind of work and really want to change practice in order to achieve that. In the same way we have lots of people networked around things like evidence-based policing and so on. And we at the Police Foundation are definitely thinking about ways we might be able to help to sort of grow and develop such a network. And finally, we need policy, because a lot of the obstacles and the barriers to prevention are things that need policymakers to make changes, and whether that's around, how do we share data between public services, or how do we design workforces across our public services in ways that their skills are aligned in the right places, how do we design our governance landscape so that it doesn't get in the way, and the different ways in which people are held to account doesn't get in the way of working together. All of those things require some policy change. And we're also going to be trying to do a piece of work at the Foundation looking at what are the conditions for preventative policing? What are the background conditions, the infrastructure that could really help make this shift? But the final thing I wanted to say is just that all of that can sound quite daunting to get from where we are now to somewhere quite different. But I'm optimistic about it, and I'm optimistic about it because there's already a lot of good work that's going on, and I'm sure Serena will be talking about that. There is a really strong evidence base, and we just need to sort of mobilize that, and it's a really persuasive evidence base. There are really good examples all around the country of people doing really innovative work and shifting things in a more preventative direction. But most of all, I think, there's a lot of energy and motivation and enthusiasm for this agenda among police officers and staff. And whenever I talk about it to people, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm. Everyone recognises this is the kind of direction we need to shift in. And it's that energy and enthusiasm, I think, that will ultimately drive this thing forward, alongside getting support from government so that we can start thinking long-term about how we shift this. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody. So perhaps Rick and I should have compared notes on our slides before we came up here together. So there will be a little bit of duplication, but hopefully I can bring to life to you over about the next 20 minutes around some of the work that we're doing through the National Prevention Coordination Committee, which speaks to the heart of the very points that Rick has made. And I will weave in throughout the presentation why I think prevention is so important to policing. And I'll also just give you a little bit of context around Merseyside. So I've been chief now for 2.5 years. Boy, what a time that has been. Brilliant in so many ways. But we have suffered as a region some of the most terrible and tragic incidents. Clearly, we heard about the murder of Olivia last night. And we've also been on the national and international stage with some of the events which the region has hosted. So in November 2021, we had the explosion outside the Liverpool Women's Hospital, the first suicide bomb in the Liverpool City region, followed by the highly publicised murders, which I will come on to between August and December last year. The policing of the Grand National, which was a heart-stopping 9 minutes when we saw 3 JSO protesters get onto the course. And having made the decision not to go and sit on the Gold Commander's back and watch it from home, it really was nail-biting. And we then saw the policing of the world's largest music event, watched by more people than watched the whole of the Olympic Games. Who knew? Eurovision was an absolutely fantastic occasion. For me, it showcased the very best of policing, its leadership, its partnership working and its community engagement. And as chief, I'm incredibly proud of every single person in the force, and I'm always very clear, no matter what their role is, whether we had to make sure that the mutual aid which many of your forces gave to us had vehicles to drive, the budgets were sorted so people got paid, they'd got access to IT, swipe cards to get in buildings, clean buildings to work in, turning out and making a brew for people who are on the cordon or have been directly involved in leading the investigations or providing that community reassurance. I am fortunate as chief to have brilliant people doing brilliant things 24/7, 365 days a year. There will be a link to our recruitment at the end of the session. So, I said I would come back to the murders. So over a 6-day period last year, and we were in the throes of it this time last year, 3 people were murdered: Sam Rimmer, Ashley Dale, and 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell. As you can imagine, there was absolute outrage, uproar, anger and grief in our city. And Olivia, coincidentally, was killed on the 15th anniversary of the murder of Rhys Jones, who was an 11-year-old boy who was shot whilst walking home from footy training. There was a real hunger in the region, and indeed nationally, to catch the people responsible for those murders. But the communities were also asking us, what are we going to do to prevent it happening again? Now, they weren't just asking the police what we were going to do. There was a real recognition from our communities that it was actually policing partners and community who needed to work together to prevent those reoccurrence. And for me, that's exactly what preventative policing is about. Now, you've already seen Sir Robert Peel, and the ninth Peelian principle is there. And I sometimes feel that that has got lost, and we should actually be judged on the absence of crime, not necessarily judged on our outcomes all the time. We know that policing is a service of last resort, and often our role takes us far away from what our original mission was, because no one else has the capacity to respond. Policing absolutely has to do law enforcement. This is not me not saying that we shouldn't do law enforcement. We are the most identifiable law enforcement agency. We must make full use of our powers. We must take the fight to the criminals, and we must ensure that we relentlessly pursue those criminals who target the vulnerable and blight the lives of communities. We must deliver the excellence in those basics. But, you know, with rising demand, increasing complexity, that continued expansion of the policing mission, the expectation that we will pick up the pieces, and also, as we know, 80% of our demand is not actually crime-related. And as Rick says, policing needs to be part of the solution to those issues. Policing needs to be involved in that whole public service system to make sure that the right agency is delivering the right intervention and the treatment at the right time. But for me, that speaks to the very case as to why policing should be involved in prevention. So, Rick said that we need a vision. We now have that vision. So for the first time ever, policing has a national preventative policing strategy, which you can see on the screen there. I don't expect you to be able to read it all clearly because it's very small. But it really has embedded prevention as one of the core policing functions. And the key bits that the strategy talks to: embedding cultural change, reducing harm, reducing reoffending, and reducing demand through evidence-based problem-solving approaches. So the work that we're doing is driven through the coordination committee, and you might just be able to make out on this slide some of the portfolios that work into that coordination committee. So alcohol licensing, serious violence, problem solving, women in the criminal justice system. I have to say we're a bit of a unique committee, so we operate across the other committees as well as having bespoke pieces of work. And we have a number of collaborative partners who work with us just in the same way as we should work collaboratively in preventive policing. So we work really closely with the college, HMIC, and also the Society for Evidence-Based Practice. And I know what many of the speakers at this conference have talked about the trust and confidence deficit that policing is experiencing at this moment in time. That relationship between the police service and our public is absolutely critical to the preserve of British policing, and something that we are very proud of. We know, and we've heard many times over the last few days, this relationship has faced that greatest period of challenge. And I know everybody in the room will say this is simply not good enough and we have to do better. So one of the pieces of work that we are doing under the Prevention Coordination Committee is the historic data wash. So you will be aware that this key piece of work was requested by the Home Office and requested chiefs on the back of the abhorrent crimes committed by David Carrick that we carry out this historic data wash across PND. And forces have until the 29th of September to consider that data, the data return. I'm pleased to say we have to get the data back by the 29th of September, and virtually 98% of all forces have done that historic data wash. Now, the headlines there mention Carrick and Cousins, so big focus on the Metropolitan Police. This is not a Metropolitan Police issue, and anybody that thinks it is failing their communities and failing their staff. We all have cases ongoing in our forces, and we absolutely have to be proactive in our approach. And I genuinely, unfortunately, think that the cases will start to rise until that preventative and proactive work that we're doing kick in, which is hopefully you'll agree that the importance of the historic data wash and the impact that that will have as we need to rebuild the trust and confidence in our communities, but also the trust our colleagues have in us. As Chief of Merseyside, I have said our #1 priority has to be building trust and confidence in our communities, because without it, we can't continue to police with consent, and it is that very essence of British policing. So in January 2024, the results will be published from the historic data wash, and I have real confidence that the majority of our workforce will fall under the category which we are classifying as individuals with no concern. But I also know that there will be results that will come under intense media scrutiny. I think that what that's highlighted is there is a real need to have a continuous integrity screening solution that will highlight those adverse incidents as they get uploaded onto PND, and it flags automatically with the forces so that we can deal with them with the earliest opportunity. And I will keep you posted, because we are doing that development work as we're going, and we are consulting with the Superintendents Association on it. One of the many challenges I face as the chair of the committee is articulating to colleagues and partners the cost-benefit of prevention activity. And as you'll appreciate, it's really hard to capture those results because we don't actually always see the immediate results of them. We need to invest in the long term and look at that long-term impact on individuals, families, communities, and also economies. And we might not actually see the benefits within policing. It might be in other public services. And I have to say, this is getting harder and harder as we see that continual drive for results, outcomes, accountability that can be published or put into league tables, and that is then applauded by a political party as a success. But again, I go back, this is saying policing absolutely must answer the phone. We must respond to the contact. We must focus on the quality of the interaction. We must respond in a timely manner. We must deal with incidents and crimes that are reported in a professional, courteous, compassionate and effective manner. We must look at the outcome that is right for the victim, even though it might not be a positive outcome. These are the very basics that we should be excellent at and our community should expect and demand from us. I have to say, I am very concerned at this moment in time, the drive for league tables and pitting forces against each other, and we'll see that position probably worsen over the next 6 to 12 months. I do fear that we'll start to see some perverse behaviours by people intent on hitting the target but missing the point, and the most important people in all of that is our communities. But that is probably a whole different session. So back to prevention. So more and more frequently we are being compared to health and the model hospital. So how if we spend X on a hip replacement, it will save the health service Y. And policing's response historically has been, well, we're not like the health service. There's far more variables in policing than there is in the health service. And I myself have said that, and whilst I do agree with it, it's rather a lazy argument. And with the financial climate in the way in which it is, I do think we as policing have much more of a responsibility to put forward that evidenced argument. That economic analysis allows policymakers and operational leaders to use data to make better informed decisions, choose interventions that provide best value for money and improve the efficiency of our scarce resources. So under the committee we've created a task force, or a task and finish group should I say, which has started looking at this and is looking at how we cost preventative policing. So we've commissioned Professor Stuart Kirby, who is a retired Detective Chief Superintendent from Lancashire Police, but now a professor at UCLan, to do a piece of work on cost-benefits analysis, the results of which are fascinating. Shockingly, there has only been 216 academic studies in relation to cost-benefits analysis in policing. And when we compare that with education, there's been 10,000 studies. And we compare that with health, there's been 84,000 studies. So when we say we're not comparable to health, whilst I agree, we absolutely have to do better at our research and being able to evidence our argument. And the same with education, the use of the Education Endowment Fund, which I will come back to, and their use of evidence-based programmes in order to improve educational standards and attainment. So no wonder when we only have 216 studies, do we struggle to articulate to the Home Office why we should invest in prevention. And when we have discussions about comprehensive spending reviews, the Health Service can absolutely articulate very clearly, because they've done 84,000 studies internationally, why we should invest in it. And then I would pose the question, do we actually do cost-benefits analysis? And I would say it's questionable, and the answer is probably no. Now, this is the science bit, and after being up late last night, just bear with me. So in the majority of cases, what we are actually doing is cost feasibility studies. So it looks at the implementation costs of something that you might have read, borrowed with pride, and whether it's actually affordable. If we're a little bit better, we probably do cost effectiveness studies. So we look at what's achieved through that investment when compared to an alternative. So using prevention leaflets on an estate compared to forensic marking on another estate. What we rarely do is proper cost benefits analysis, which monetises all the costs and then the benefits, and then seeks to show that overall net benefit of initiative outweighing the investment. And we rarely do it for policing, and let alone when we look across the other government departments and into our partners. So working with policing, the Home Office and academia, we are looking to do that work, produce a list of nationally verified costs to provide a foundation so that we can start that work. And it will link closely in the work that the Home Office have done, in which 35 forces participated, the old analysis, activity analysis. For me, that work demonstrates the benefits of investing in prevention, not only to us, but also to our wider workforce, but it absolutely needs to influence the government on those spending reviews. So we are also working with Alan Pewsley and his team, who's doing obviously the 12-month National Review of Policing, which was commissioned by the Home Secretary, and is due to report back this month. It does provide a great opportunity for us to articulate to the government the scale of the challenge being faced by policing, which is outside of our mission. And Alan and his team are actually looking at the education endowment, the way in which the education endowment drives evidence-led good practice. So we're working with Alan's team and also the College of Policing, because actually, as Rick articulated, what we need is a vibrant and connected network of researchers and practitioners who share the evidence, the opportunities and the challenges. We need a programmatic resource that funds research and evaluations, and that's what the Education Foundation does, and that's where Alan's looking to close that gap. And we need an evidence library that can collate and disseminate best practice and ensure the skills and doctrines are available across the 43 forces. And that's what the College of Policing is already doing through the What Works and the Smarter Practice. So the Prevention Coordination Committee are working with the Chief Scientific Officer, Paul Taylor, and also the Economic Social Research Council to develop a Network Plus, which will be that first part. It will bring together academics, policing and industry so that we can really start to improve that evidence base and not find ourselves like we had with cost benefits analysis with a lowly 216 pieces of research. So the Home Affairs Select Committee is currently examining future policing priorities and is exploring what does a modern police service look like that's fit for the late 2020s and beyond. How can policing adapt to those future challenges and what can be done to improve confidence in policing? And I have to say that there does appear to be a genuine interest from the Policing Minister in relation to prevention and getting upstream of that demand to stop it coming into policing. I think we've seen that with Right Care, Right Person in the speed in which that's been progressed, but also how we can invest in preventative measures in relation to early intervention. I think that's demonstrated through what the serious violence duty is trying to achieve, but I have to say, I think there's some difficulties with it at the moment. It seems that policing is the only agency being held to account through the serious violence duty, and actually it should be our partners who are standing side by side with us with their accountability. They've also invested in the Clear Hold Build initiatives and commissioned recent work around persistent offenders, 50,000 persistent offenders, and how we manage that the demand from that cohort. Those young people who are about to become prolific and persistent offenders, and what can we do to prevent that happening? The evidence suggests that reoffending is much lower if an out-of-court disposal is used, especially in young people. But unfortunately, whilst it's absolutely the right thing to do for our communities and for our young people, you will know, for those of you in the crime world, it's not counted in our bucket of positive outcomes. So forces are not investing in out-of-court disposals and the use of outcome 22. We are hitting the target, but missing the point where we should be focusing on doing the right thing for our young people. So as a committee, we've asked for further work by the Home Office on Outcomes 22 and how we can make it a positive outcome, which will encourage, hopefully, forces to engage in that work more proactively. And we heard the brilliant question by Paul Fotheringham to Yvette Cooper yesterday, I think it was. Paul asked the question around community safety partnerships, and Rick mentioned it. And Yvette was very clear about her commitment, if she becomes the Home Secretary, around needing that cross-government work. And that's part of my role as Chair of the Coordination Committee, is how do we start to operate much more effectively across the different government departments? Because if we are going to nail preventative policing, that's absolutely what we need. The other key part of the work is embedding a preventative culture across policing. And I have to say this is probably one of the hardest challenges we face. And I think your response to the question from Rick, do you think policing focuses on prevention, speaks to that very point. And again, it's made harder by some attitudes that focus on the short term. So, I'm going to show you a video now, and the line I always use on this video was pinched by Sir Mark yesterday. So this time last year, Joanne would not let her children play out on the street. She lives in the community where Olivia was murdered. And as a mum, I can absolutely understand why she would not let her children play out. Since that time, Joanne has become a local councillor. She's really engaged in Operation Evolve, which is our Clear Hold Build response. So this was filmed last year, not just a few weeks ago, like in the Met, so I'm claiming it.
You don't want to feel unsafe in your own community, and recently, unfortunately, that's how myself and so many people in the community felt. Now I feel like we are making strides to feel safer, make it safer for all of our children.
So the Clear is to come in and try and rid the area of all the the crime, the gangs that are causing, you know, all the problems in the area, terrorising people, and basically making the area not a nice place to live. The hold is to try and sort of stabilise the area and stop others taking the place. You know, we know that's happened in other areas where one gang's been removed, but somebody's just come in and taken the place, so it's trying to stop that. And then there's a build, which is really building on the area itself and build areas where people want to live and want to stay here and work here and send their kids to school here.
The end game for us here, the goal for us here, is for communities to tell us that they feel safer, they can see the difference in their communities, they feel safer in their homes. That's what we want to achieve it. If you look at our relentless approach to tackling criminality, tackling organised crime, we've delivered over 400 arrests under Operation Miller, 80 search warrants, 11 firearms taken off the streets. The feedback we're getting is the communities very much welcome this as a beginning of a new approach to working with them. We're here for the long term to work with our communities to make a difference.
People are starting to feel a bit safer, but it's not going to happen overnight. I think this is a long-term project, and I think it's very important that it's community-led, because there's no point in imposing things on communities. I think the community really need to be involved in that too.
For everything we do, you know, we realise you can't do it alone. You need to work with people. You need to pool resources. You need to see who can bring what to the table and how we can work together.
So it's really important for me as a partner to be engaged in this type of event today and to commit, you know, Knowsley Council and its resources to supporting Mears Police and tackling this abhorrent issue.
So prevention is about taking that joined up approach with colleagues, partners, communities to identify the crossovers, the duplication, to collaborate and design that whole system. But more importantly, it develops an approach that simplifies this for our end users and our most important people, our community. It's not just an approach that needs to be taken by our brilliant PCSOs and local policing officers. It needs to be taken by everyone. It doesn't need to be complicated. Sometimes it just needs a shift in thinking. We need to think prevention first. We need to identify the root cause. It's about asking the right question. What I talk about in Merseyside is the question why is the most important thing. Why am I here? What am I dealing with? So I'm just going to show you a video to finish with. Dan's words are echoing. I think I should just about get in and finish on time.
If I told you I was wearing makeup to cover the bruises on my face, what would you do?
If I told you whenever I tell you my friends that I am being abused by my partner, but they think I am joking, what would you do?
If I told you that the reason I keep calling the police is because I've got no one else to talk to, what would you do?
If I told you that I lost my home, sleep on the street, and I don't know where to turn, what would you do?
If I told you we skip breakfast to save money, what would you do?
If I told you that I pick my pension up every week and store it under the bed because I don't trust the banks, what would you do?
If you saw me out of school with an older child during the day, what would you do?
If I told you my partner says they love me, but takes all my money and stops me seeing family and friends, what would you do?
What would you do?
So many of the issues highlighted on that video are not policing problems, but they are continually, day after day, 24/7, coming into our contact centre. What is policing's responsibility to deal with them? How can we work across that whole system to do the right thing for those people on the video, our communities, but also to prevent the demand coming into our contact system? So my question to you, having watched that video, what are you going to do when you get back to your force to embed that preventative approach in your area of work? Thank you.